Hello everyone, welcome to Classic Readings of Chinese and English Literature. I'm Ruo Qianpu from the College of Foreign Studies of Jilan University.
And I am James, a guest teacher in the College of Foreign Studies at Jinan University.
In the following 3 chapters, we will talk about Chinese classics in English poetry, analyzing poems written by Ezra Pound, Gary Slider, and Marilyn Chen. And the topics we are going to deal with are the following: Ezra Pound and classical Chinese poetry, Gary Slider and the Cold Mountain poems, Chinese-American poet Marilyn Chen and ancient Chinese poet Cai Yan. James, let's start with Ezra Pound.
Yes. Ezra Pound was an American expatriate poet and critic who was a major figure of the modernist movement in poetry from the early to mid-20th century. He was the driving force behind several modernist movements, notably Imagism and Vorticism. He published over 70 books and translated Chinese poetry and Japanese plays with a clear, economical, and concrete style. Great literature is simply language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree, said Pound. Professor Pu, could you tell us more about the life of Ezra Pound?
Yes, of course. Pound was born in Idaho and raised in Wyncote, Philadelphia. At the age of 12, he entered military school and learned Greek and Latin. He then studied languages at the University of Pennsylvania and became friends with William Carlos Williams there. Pound studied Anglo-Saxon and Romance languages at Hamilton College from 1903 to 1906. In 1908, Pound traveled widely across Europe. He founded with Richard Aldington and others the literary movement Imagism and edited its first anthology, These Imagists, which was published in 1914. Pound moved to Paris in 1920. 4 years later, he settled in Italy. In 1933, he met Mussolini and saw in him Italy's long-needed economic and social reformer. During World War II, he made a series of hysterical and bitter video broadcasts that were openly fascist. In 1945, he was arrested by the U.S. forces. Pound spent 12 years in Washington in a hospital for the criminally insane, and he died in Dallas in 1972. So, James, do you know the literary achievements and literary influence of Ezra Pound?
I certainly do. Pound spent much of his time concerned with promoting the careers of many of the great writers of his time, and was a key figure in the publication of many influential works. He provided invaluable feedback to T.S. Eliot on the manuscript of The Waste Land, and he encouraged Ernest Hemingway and others as well. According to Catherine Ann Porter, Pound was one of the most opinionated and unselfish men who ever lived, and he made friends and enemies everywhere by the simple exercise of the classic American constitutional right of free speech. In late April 1912, Pound formulated the term Imagist based on his earlier ideas on poetic creation, and served as a spokesman for this movement. Professor Pu, could you tell us more about the principles of the Imagist movement?
Of course I can. In the March 1913 issue of Poetry, Pound drafted a few principles of the movement. First, direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. Third, regarding reason, to compose in a sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of a metronome. Pound developed this concept through a series of publications such as These Imagists. The 20th century saw the decline of the English poetic tradition in Europe as well as the eclipse of Whitmanian tradition of new poetry among emerging poets. Therefore, with Imagism, Pound sought to establish a new style of poetic writing, which stressed concrete speech and natural images. Pound was a revolutionary in poetry and other aspects. As Lado commented on him, Ezra Pound loved to jump from idea to idea, from culture to culture, from lyric to epic. In parallel with Imagism, Pound thinks it is necessary to find a pure color in foreign culture and literature beyond Anglo-American new poetry, based on which we may create great works that are truly worthy of the times. Imagism took a lot of inspirations from classical Chinese literature. James, could you please tell us more about this?
Absolutely. Thanks, Professor Pu. Chinese culture and literature are important exotic inspirations for Pound. Facing the decline of the English poetic tradition and Whitmanian new poetry, Pound, who loved to jump, never stopped seeking a breakthrough. He found a pure color in classical Chinese poetry. Pound's earliest contact with Chinese art began with a vase from the Ming Dynasty that his parents had in Philadelphia. When he started his college life, a display cabinet of Chinese ceramics, ink paintings, and wood carvings was open. In his last years in America, during a visit to New York, Pound saw a screen book with waterscape scenes alongside manuscript poems in Chinese and Japanese. This screen book would become a major source of the Seven Lakes Canto. Between 1910 and 1912, an exhibition of Chinese and Japanese paintings was hosted in a British museum, through which Pound expanded his appreciation and understanding of Chinese culture. But, Professor, how did Pound grow his knowledge of the Chinese language?
That is a great question. Actually, Ezra Pound didn't know Chinese at all. In fact, his work, Cassay, is not a translation from Chinese, but from a Japanese manuscript. In late 1913, Pound received the posthumous manuscripts of earliest Spinoza, an Orientalist, which consisted of Spinoza's translations of a number of classic Chinese poems. In 1915, Cassay, a small volume of Pound's translations of 19 Chinese poems, was published. Pound's Cassay is a creative translation of classic Chinese poems based on Spinoza's work. A lot of his great works, cantos, is greatly influenced by these manuscripts. It is an impediment interplay of various fine cultural contexts, lucid and unique moments which include montage technique borrowed from Chinese poetry and characters, as well as juxtaposition in terms of cultural contexts. James, what did literary critics think about Pound and his works?
That's a great question, Professor Pu. In fact, Pound was familiar with Greek, Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, and other languages, literature, and cultures. But he found that Chinese culture is the most influential, and that what Chinese culture is to Imagist poetry is what Greek culture is to the Renaissance. Zhao Yiheng, in his Wandering Poetic Genius, says that Pound elevated absorption of Chinese poetry as the purpose of the new poetry movement in the early stage, and never stopped promoting Chinese poetics for the rest of his life. As a result, American poetry was influenced by the Chinese poetic tradition during the development of Imagist poetry. Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, Kenneth Rexroth, and Gary Snyder were representatives of this poetic writing style. And Chinese American poetry, to some extent, followed this trend. Pound pointed out that there is harmony between Chinese poetry and the principles of imagism. That is, vivid presentation and non-moralizing of the subject.
That's right. Pond encountered Chinese culture in Philolossa's manuscripts, and Cathay is a wonderful fruit of this encounter. However, there has been a long-lasting debate over the categorization of Cathay. Is it a translation of classical Chinese poems or a collection of English poetry? Can one translate poetry without knowing the source language? Certainly, that was what Ezra Pond did. In his volume Cathay, Pond translates a total of 19 pieces of ancient Chinese poetry spanning the period from the 11th century BC to the 4th century AD. But of course, he couldn't have done it without help from someone who had knowledge of the Chinese language. In this case, earliest Philolossa, an American Orientalist, helped him. The unusual situation, however, was that Pond was approached by Philolossa's wife after his death. At the time, in the 1910s to 20s, English information about Chinese poetry must have been scarce. Thus, Pond's only basis for the translation was Philolossa's meticulous unpublished notes. In addition to providing the word-by-word mapping between Japanese and English, the notes also included a line-by-line draft translation into English.
Yes, therefore, there are different views towards Cathay. Hugh Kenner read Cathay mainly as English poems, while Wai Lim Yip strongly pointed out that some of the poems, compared with translations in other languages, are said to be close to the original in the sequence of images, rhythm, effects. From Ming Xie's perspective, Pound was essentially an appropriate translator. The act of translation is to relive these traces and make them one's own. In addition, Cathay is a canon of examples for the reform and rejuvenation of English poetry. Pound defended himself. He felt that he appropriately conveyed more of his poetry than exact representations of a foreign literature, when some thought that his lack of Chinese impeded his translations. Now, these are very controversial, critical views. So the best way for us to know Pound and his poetry is to study his work in depth.
And that is the end of this chapter. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
Goodbye.